Start screen.
Rabbi jumped out on the.
Good morning. Good morning. Today's daf is Sanhedrin daf Nun Hey. We're going to pick up on Nun Daled Amud Beis, just reminding ourselves of the Gemara that we learned yesterday, all the way at the end of the Gemara. We begin today by thanking our sponsors. We thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsors, the Tilson family of Eretz Yisrael, for sponsoring all the shiur and all the drashas of 5785. As a schos for B'suras Tevis for all of Klal Yisrael. We also thank our week of learning sponsors. We thank Beryl and Rachel Galkin for sponsoring all the shiurim of this week in commemoration of Beryl's grandfather's yahrzeit, Beryl ben Reb Chaim, whose yahrzeit was yesterday on Yud Aleph Shvat. We also thank the sponsor for our Daf Yomi shiur today, Adam Plunker, for sponsoring the Daf Yomi in memory of Harry Plunker, Yachmiel, Hirsch, Ben Yisrael, the Neshama should have an aliyah. The family should have a nechama. We also thank Yona Openden for sponsoring Daf Yomi today for a zechus for a refuah shlema for Yossi Openden, Yosef Nissen ben Yafa Shteindel Gittel, who is having back surgery today. Yossi should have a full speedy recovery. He should be pain-free and back to taking out the garbage speedily in our days. And on a serious note, Yossi, we wish you a refuah shlema. Hopefully the surgery goes well. Kadosh Baruch Hu be with you. We also thank our Daf Yomi sponsorship, wishing tremendous mazel tov to Rabbi and Dr. Richter and the birth of a baby boy. Thank you so much for the sponsorship. Yes, we'd like to share tremendous simcha baruch Hashem. My wife was able to give birth yesterday. Our family is thrilled to welcome another boy to the Richter family. Mirz Hashem, we look forward to celebrating with you, making Shalom Zacher this week, and Mirz Hashem a bris coming up. And we look forward to bringing nachas to Klal Yisrael. And Mirz Hashem, he should bring nachas to his parents as well. Yesterday, someone told me that I was out of line. I was wearing my jacket during the Daf Yomi shir. Sorry. That's the only thing I was out of line for yesterday. I'll take it. Yesterday, we ended off the Gemara with a machlokes, all the way at the bottom of the Amud, between Rav and Shmuel, about when you have a zachar who is the recipient of mishkav zachar, does it follow the halachas of mishkav isha, or does it follow the halachas of shochev of a zachar? In other words, we know that when it comes to a girl, halachically, the bia with a girl is only considered to be a bia from above the age of 3. When it comes to a boy, the bia is only considered to be a bia when the boy is boel somebody only from the age of 9. So when the boy is the recipient, does his action follow the action of being the mishkav, where he would have to be 9 years old, or does the action follow the halachas of mishkavei isha, because mishkavei isha would be from the age of 3. In other words, does the act of acting like the woman make that the zachar has the halacha of a woman, or does the zachar always follow the halacha of the zachar, and therefore he would have to be 9 years old regardless of which position he would be playing? And the Gemara says, Tanya Kavasei de Rav, the Gemara wants to bring up a raya to Rav. Zachar, the way to read this is zachar. We're all good, Jeremy? The way to read this is zachor. In other words, we're referring to, as we mentioned yesterday, Rashi told us, whenever it says zachor, it's referring to the act of the zachar being in the position of the mishkavei isha. The halacha is ben teisha shanim v'yom echad, from 9 years and 1 day. Now, you typically would read this as a continuing sentence, but Rashi tells us we should read it mili katani. So that's one case. You have one case which is zachar ben teisha shanim v'yom echad, or haba al behema ben kedarka ben shlo kedarka. A person has a relationship with the animal, whether the relationship with the animal is in a normal way or an abnormal way. And a woman who brings an animal upon her, again, bein kedarka, bein shlo kedarka, whether it's the normal way of bia or it's not the normal way of bia, the halacha is chayiv. So what do you see clearly over here? It seems like an open and shut raya, like Rav, that when it comes to a zachar, it is still going to be from the age of 9, not from the age of 3. So that seems to be the end of the Gemara's raya. Now the Gemara goes on a little bit further is going to use this brayso that we just mentioned to disprove another shita. Now the Gemara says, Darash Rav Nachman, Darash Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda. Nachman bar Rav Chisda made the following drasha. Be'isha, it says, Shnei mishkavais. U'behema, mishkav echad. By Isha it says Mishkevei Isha, which is a plural. And when it comes to a Behema, it says Mishkavecha. The pasuk uses a singular term. Now, Maskuf Law Papa asks the following question. Adarabba, if you're using logic, that doesn't make sense. Isha de Orcha, a woman who it's normal for a person to engage in intimacy with her, you should say, a mishkav mechayev, a midam achrina loy mechayev. On a normal way of being intimate with a woman, if the person has that kind of intimacy in a way that's going to be asur, in such a case it would be forbidden. Behema, the lav orchehi, behema, the whole thing is not normal. There's no such thing as a normal way of being intimate with an animal. So if a person's going to go ahead and do that, then l'chayev la al kol nekev u'nekev. You should be mechayev on any type of intercourse with this animal. In other words, the whole idea of saying, oh yeah, a person's going to be intimate with an animal, kedarka, the normal way. The whole thing doesn't make any sense. It's not normal, the whole thing is not normal. Now the way Rashi explains this is, when it comes to an isha, so there's an element of hana over there on the recipient. So again, when it comes to an isha, to a woman, there's a normal way of a woman enjoying intimacy. So that would be kedarka. That would not be shalo kedarka. However, when it comes to an animal, the whole idea is really the person who is engaging in this behavior with this animal. Now, what's the difference if from the animal side, it's going to be what a woman would consider to be normal? Again, the whole thing from a human perspective is not normal. So therefore, we should make a difference between the normal way of being intimate and the abnormal way of being intimate. The whole thing doesn't make any sense. Therefore, Papa says it should really be the opposite. Now, the truth is, it doesn't really mean. If you look at Tosfos, he says, Adarabba Isha de Orcha. He says, Hapshita bekule Shas. It's obvious in all of Shas. The Beisha Mischayev Ashnei Mishkavos. Why the Mishkavei Isha Ksiv? In other words, the truth is, Rava is not really trying to tell you that if a person is going to be intimate with a woman to whom it is asur to be intimate with, he's going to be intimate with her in what we'd call biyah shlo kedarka, an abnormal way that he would not be chayav. In other words, the Gemara is not trying to say that because there are psukim and there are mishnayos that say he is chayav. Rapapa can't argue on that. Rather, his point is el Rapapa hachi kama. This is what Rapapa meant to say. Im yesh lechalik bin isha lebehema. If you would like to differentiate between an animal and a woman, ipcha havale lememar. Your logic would have dictated the other way around. In other words, not that he's saying that the halacha would be the opposite, but again, if you're going to use logic to go ahead to determine which way would be chayiv, which way would not be chayiv, then the opposite should be true. That by an isha, it should only be the normal way of being intimate, but by an animal, since the whole thing is absurd, so therefore there's no such thing as a normal way of doing it. Thank you for bringing me coffee. The Gemara says, however, as much as that logic would make sense, the problem is, Tanya, we learned in a brayso, Zachar, as we just mentioned, ben Tesha Shanav Yom Echad. If he's 9 years in 1 day, Habal Behema, or someone who has this relationship with an animal, it says very clearly, Ben Kedarka, Ben Shalo Kedarka, makes no difference if it's the normal way or the abnormal way. Again, anatomically the normal way or the abnormal way. V'isha hamivias behema le Ben Kedarka, Ben Shalo Kedarka chayev. The halacha is, regardless of what you would have thought, regardless of what the logic would have dictated, the halacha is still going to be the same. That in any way a person is going to be intimate with a woman or with an animal. In a case where it's going to be forbidden, an animal it's always going to be forbidden with a woman, depending on who the woman is. In any case where it's done, any type of intimacy, whether it's kedarka or shelo kedarka, whether it's the normal anatomical way or the abnormal anatomical way, the halacha still would be that they're chayiv, they're in violation of the iser, and in other words, the logic that we said, that when it comes to an animal, it should be both. When it comes to an isha, it shall only be one. It makes no difference. Okay, the Gemara continues. Amalei Ravina l'Rava. Ravina asks the following question: Hama'ara b'zachar mahu. So when it comes to the halachas of bia, we've learned this in a couple other masechtas. There's basically for there's basically three levels of bia. There's what's called neshikas ha'ever, where it's just a touch of the human body from one to the next. And then there's hachnasas ha'ever, there's hachnasas kol atara, and then there's something called the gemar bia. So the neshika obviously is the initial touch, and then there is the part where it starts to penetrate, and then there's the full penetration. Ma'ara, it's machlokes what that is. Either it's the initial touch, or it's the initial penetration. Now, the halach is when it comes to a nida, it's very clear. It says in the pasuk, it's mekaira hera. Rashi brings this down. The Gemara is going to mention it soon. That's mekaira hera. It says very clearly in the pasuk, a person does not have to actually complete the bia for a person to violate bia with a nida. As long as a person has hara with a nida, they're already in violation of being bol a nida, and there's a chi of karas. Now the Gemara wants to know what happens if a person does this hara with a zachar. Again, being intimate with a zachar is also. It's nisma deraisa. We'll be talking about that. So now the Gemara is asking, to what extent does the person have to be intimate? If it simply touches, or again, because it's machlokes, or if the penetration begins, is that enough? Or does it have to be what we refer to as a gemar bia, as a completion, a complete full penetration? The Gemara says, Ma'ar b'zachar mahu. What's the halacha if it's just hara? The Gemara says, Ma'ar b'zachar. What's your question? Mishkavei isha ksiv. The Gemara refers to that as Mishkavei Isha. Now, there's got to be a reason why the pasuk referred to it as Mishkavei Isha. The Mishkavei Isha, we know when it comes to being intimate with a woman to whom it's forbidden, the halach is even hara is going to be a problem. So the Gemara says, Ella hama'ar b'behema mal. The Gemara wanted to know what's the halacha with regard to an animal, if it's just hara. If there's no gemar bia, but just hara, then what's the halacha? The Gemara says, Amar lei, now the pasuk says very clearly when it comes to achais aviv and achais imay, it says very clearly in the pasuk. The lashon of the pasuk is ki es she'eroi ha'ara. So it says very clearly the lashon of hara there. Therefore, anytime a person engages in that kind of relationship, it does not have to be a complete bia. Even the initial penetration is a problem. So then, why does it say it? What's the point of saying? In other words, the Gemara means to say, when it comes to all mishkavei isha, there's a hekesh which compares it. It says very clearly in the Gemara, why? Delight tzricha. It doesn't have to say it. Why not? The ha'iskish la'ara the nida. Nida is the initial place where it says the smekara hera, it's a problem, and all other arayas are juxtaposed to the halacha of nida. So therefore, when it comes to all forbidden kinds of relationships, even if there's an initial penetration, it's going to be a problem because of this hekesh. So why does the pasuk have to say it when it comes to achais aviv, which is an aunt, or achais ima, again another aunt, an aunt from the father or for the mother? Why does it say it there? As we mentioned yesterday, we have this klal. If the pasuk tells us something which is not necessary, and we're allowed to borrow it and apply it to another case, then teneu inyan lahara de behema. You could borrow those extra words and apply it to hara de behema, and therefore, just like any kind of intimacy, there's also with an animal, hara is going to be us with an animal as well, and it follows all the other halachas of intimacy, that even the initial contact is going to be a problem. Now, Gemara says, hold on a second. Let's analyze this for a second. Behema mechayve misa is bezdinhi. You have to put things in different categories. A behema, when a person violates that isser, they're chayiv misa from beis din. This is something which is adjudicated by a beis din, a basar b'dam, of not by a kadosh baruch hu, but by a beis din. And then why? Lama lid ksiv lara dida gabe chayav krisis. Why is it that it's going to be connected with family members that are chayav krisis, like an aunt? Those are closely related, and that a kadosh baruch hu takes care of. Those things are not adjudicated by a beis din. So why would you write the words, the extra words, ki es she'eroi hara, by someone who's chayav misa bidei shemayim through krisis? Through kares, why wouldn't you write it by a case which is more similar, which is mechayev misas bezdin? Lekasvi gabe chayev misas bezdin, v'ligmar chayev misas bezdin, mechayev misas bezdin. The Gemara says that hayal, since v'kulei kra l'drasha hu da'asa ksiva nana milsa d'drasha. The Gemara says, and Rashi points this out, that the psukim are repeated in Parshas Achrimos and in Kedoshim. The psukim are said twice. So if you ever have psukim that are said twice, they're there the entire second time that they're written, is for a drasha, is to teach you something to learn from. Now, since they were written at extra time to teach you extra halachos, the Gemara says we had no problem adding in some extra halachos over there to borrow to other cases. So in other words, the bottom line is, when it comes to hara, it's going to be a problem. It's always a problem by zachar. It's always a problem by isha. The chiddush of today's shir is it's a problem by behema as well. And how do you know that? You learn that out from the extra words as kishe'eroi hara, which is extra and unnecessary to write by an aunt through the mother or through the father. So since there was extra over there, because we knew that halacha, because all mishkevei isha, all forbidden intimate relationships are compared one to the next, and therefore you don't have to write those extra words there. So this must be teaching you when it comes to a behema, to an animal, to bestiality, the halacha is going to be that even a hara is going to be a problem. Now the Gemara asks the question. Bar Ami, Rav Achtavai, the son of Ami, asked the following question to Rav Sheshes. Hama'ara ba'atzmai, what if a person does this to himself? What's the halacha? Mahu, is that going to be a problem? Amar lei, what did Rav Sheshes respond to him? Kavastem, you're driving me crazy. In other words, that's the simple understanding. There's a bunch of different ways of understanding this word kavastem. Either it comes from the word kivyostis, which is a type of ganav, or it's just like, why are you asking me questions? If you look at Rashi translates this word as kavastem, tsartani, you're bothering me. Shesha'alti davar she'efshir, you're asking me something which is impossible. Others say you're causing my stomach to turn by asking me such a ridiculous question. Now the Gemara explains why was it a ridiculous question. Amar of Ashi, maiti bailach. What is your question? In other words, let's analyze this. Because if it's talking about a person where the aver is firm, lemishkachas, it's just impossible. It's anatomically impossible for a person to do this to himself. When is this possible? We're talking about a case where a person does this with a limp aver. When it comes to all our rayas, the halacha is if a person's intimate with a limp aver, they're pater. So of course, this is giving the same exact halacha. And to those who say a person is chayiv for an intimate relationship with a limp aver, then hacha mechayiv tarti. Here, you should be chayiv twice. Mechayiv hashachim, mechayiv hanishkav. In other words, you could figure it out. In other words, if it's impossible, the whole case is impossible, why are you bothering to ask it? If the case is possible, so then how is it going to be possible? The only way it's possible is where it's halachically not considered to be a bia, according to most opinions. So therefore, it's not halachically going to be considered a bia, according to these opinions either. And if it is halachically a bia, so it is. In other words, why are you bothering to ask this question? I think that this actually brings us up to just an important discussion point. All these Gemaras over here. What are the likelihoods of these cases happening? Now, I think it's very important to note, I don't think these Gemaras are bringing up these cases because they were particularly relevant or because the culture was engaged in this kind of behavior. I mean, I hope not. I mean, I haven't lived through that all the years of this kind of culture. But the reason why the Torah brings this up is because there's no such thing as cases that are left to our imagination. The Torah governs our life. And the Torah governs every possible scenario. We can't have a situation where in one generation a person comes up with a bizarre idea and then Beis Din has to go ahead and make up the halachos. We don't make up halachos. Every single case is going to be dealt with in the Torah. It's a rucha me'eretz midah, ruchava midayam. The Torah covers every single case. This is Torah, but Torah hi l'ilmad anitzarach. We need to know what the Torah's opinion is on every single case. Every generation is going to come up with something new. Our generation has come up with a lot of new things, and we always have to know what the Torah says about every single case. We can't have a situation where, because something sounds very bizarre to us, we're going to say, you know what, we shouldn't talk about that in the Gemara. This shouldn't be brought up. This is not something which is relevant in the Gemara. You know what, it makes our stomach turn. Now, if it makes our stomach turn because the case is impossible to happen, in other words, it's just simply impossible for it to physically happen, so then don't bother asking the question. Although you can use drashas to figure it out, it's just impossible and it becomes irrelevant. But as long as something is possible, we have to know what the Torah says about it. And that's what we're doing here, to go through these cases, as much as these cases, and for the most part, sound bizarre to us. What's going on over here? Who does these kinds of things? The bottom line is, Torah hi v'lilmod anitzarach. This is Torah. We need to know what the halacha is in every single case, as disturbing as it might sound. What is the halacha? What does the Kadosh Baruch Hu want from us in this particular case? And therefore, the Gemara went through these cases. The last 2 days are testimony of that. We go through cases which I think many of us felt our stomach turning by. The bottom line is we need to know what the Torah says about it. When it comes to a case where it's just impossible for it to happen, that's when the Gemara says, okay, maybe this is Torah, but it's not limit. It's ain't limit ani tzarich. I don't need to learn this because it's just impossible. And that's why he responded to him and said, you don't have to ask this question because either it's impossible or the halacha is a davar pashut. The Gemara goes on. Ba'ominei Rav Sheshes. The Gemara asks the following question from Rav Sheshes. Ovid kichavim haba al behema mahu. If a akum, idolater, goes ahead and engages in a relationship with a behema, mahu, you put the animal to death. Now the Gemara is going to explain this question. Why not? Takala v'kalon be'inan v'hacha takala ika kalon leka odilma takala afal pisha in kalon. If you remember in our Mishnah told us 2 reasons why an animal is put to death when there is a case of bestiality between a human being and an animal. One of them was the hayil v'aslu takala ayadai. One of them is because a person went ahead and sinned by way of this animal. So in other words, this animal is the vehicle for sin, therefore we put it to death. The other way of learning it was that it's just a bizayin, this animal should be walking through the street and people are going to say, oh, this is the animal that this person was put to death over. Now, takala is the first one. Kalain is the shame, which is the second one. The question just is, do you need both? Or do you need just one? When the Mishnah told us that there are 2 reasons, was the Mishnah telling us you have to have both reasons? Or is one of them enough? What's the difference when it comes to an akum? When it comes to an akum, perhaps there's going to be a case of takala, but there won't be kalon. Why is there no kalon? Why is there no shame? Now what Rashi says is that it could be that in a certain era, a certain period of time, that different idolaters did this. Different idolaters, there have been bizarre types of avodah zarah. So maybe some idolaters did this, so it wasn't considered to be a shame for them. And more than that, it could be that even though there was some type of human dignity shame that came along with it, will the Torah go ahead and go out of its way to worry about the shame of an idolater? Is that what we're going to be worried about, to go ahead and put an animal to death for the sake of the shame of the idolater? That's the Gemara's question. Sheshes says, Tinisua, we have a Mishnah which proves this point. Ma ilanos, when it comes to trees of avodah zarah, she'ein ochlin, they don't eat, ve'ein shosin, they don't drink, ve'merichin, they cannot smell, and still amra Torah, hashches, srof, v'kala, you have to destroy them, burn them, and again, get rid of them. Hayal uba la'adam takala al yadan. Since a person went and violated an isra through them, something that goes ahead and brings a person from darkei chayim to darkei misa, to the ways, from the ways of life to the ways of death. Al achas kama v'kama. Of course, this animal should be put to death, just like a tree. So, and therefore, what he seems to be saying is, takala is enough, kalon is not necessary. In other words, there isn't as much shame when it comes to avodah zarah. That isn't shame. In other words, there's no human dignity aspect to avodah zarah, and therefore he wants to say that takala should be sufficient. Why? We see when it comes to a tree that was used for avodah zarah, we get rid of the tree. Same thing should be true when it comes to the animal, that by way of the animal, taking a person from the ways of life to the ways of death, you should go ahead and destroy the animal, even with takala alone. In other words, just with the stumbling block alone. Elamiyata, I'll tell you the truth, I wanted to look into this, but I forgot. I don't really understand the logic behind this. In other words, what does the fact that a tree doesn't eat, doesn't drink, and doesn't smell have to do with the fact that the animal brought a person from darkei chayim to darkei misa? In other words, it doesn't sound like, it's not symmetrical, right? It doesn't sound like a symmetrical, logical type of thing. In other words, if you'd say, I know that an animal does eat, does drink, and does smell, but why is that the relevant point? I must just be missing something here in the Gemara. You'll have to excuse me, but I just didn't see that the Rishonim right here on the page address it. I didn't really understand why that's the way that we do it. In other words, why can't you just say that when it comes to an animal, maybe that's the point. In other words, when it comes to an animal is Baal Chai. It's a Baal Chai. It enjoys life. And still we take away the life from the Baal Chai, Why? Because of the stumbling block that came along with it. So a tree, the Gemara doesn't say that though. The Gemara doesn't say a tree doesn't smell, it doesn't eat, it doesn't drink, it doesn't enjoy life. I don't know. Maybe that's just what the Gemara meant, that a tree doesn't enjoy life, but an animal does enjoy. Maybe that's what the Gemara meant. The animal does enjoy life, and I don't know. I don't really. You'll have to excuse me on that one. Am I missing something? I don't know. I don't think so. Okay, let's just move on. Elamiyat, the Gemara says, okay, Rav Sheshes, your opinion is that takala, a stumbling block alone, is enough. Elamiyat ovid kechavim. When it comes to avodah zara, hamashtachvel behemtoi, a person who bows down to his animal, titzar, it should become aser. Umiktala, it should be killed. That's not the halacha. You don't have to kill an animal if a person bows down to it. But again, according to your logic, you should. The Gemara says, "Mi'ika midi dil Yisrael loy asar lo'ovid kechavim." Asar, the Gemara says, this just can't be, because it can't be a situation where the Torah gives more strict halachos to an akum than it does to Yisrael. Yisrael has the highest level of opportunity and the highest level of responsibility. Those two things come together. The responsibilities of Yisrael are the highest order. Can't be the responsibilities of an akum are going to be more. So Gemara says, all right, no problem. Yisrael gufei litzer. So why don't we say it should be also for Yisrael as well? In other words, let's just think about this. Why isn't it? In other words, if we put an animal to death for engaging this type of behavior with a person, so why do we put an animal to death when a person bows down to it? A person violated avodah zarah by way of this animal. The Gemara says, "Litzer midid hava aravia." It should be the same thing. Amar Rabbi, zek kolono meruba, v'zek kolono muat. Rabbi says clearly he's not going like Rav Sheshes, and he's telling you that yes, the shame does play a role over here when it comes to a person's relationship with the animal. Yes, a person's going to be embarrassed. It's terribly embarrassing for people to be put to death because they engage in bestiality. In other words, even if there's a culture that would do it, the whole idea behind it is embarrassing. So there's a lot of shame that comes along with it. A person bows down to avodah zarah, as terrible as it is, doesn't come along with the same kind of human dignity type of shame. Gemara says, hold on. Let's go back to our tree example. Not a lot of shame when it comes to bowing down to a tree. Still, you have to destroy the tree. Gemara says, that's only when it comes to Baalei Chayim, to live things, that's where we said it. Why? We find the Torah did take tremendous precautions when it came to livestock, to animals. If a Beis Din wants to put animals to death, you need to have a Beis Din of 23 to do that. You see that the Torah is very concerned about an animal. However, when it comes to trees, you do not need to convene a Beis Din of 23 in order to decide to cut down a tree. Rava disagrees, and he says maybe the halacha is like Rav Sheshes. Amra Torah, behema nenis me'avera tihareg. You know why when it comes to the animal being killed, we put it to death? It's because the behema, he was nenis from the avera. The animal actually enjoyed it, therefore it's going to be killed. Hold on, we can always go back to this example. The tree does not enjoy when a person bows down to it. It doesn't have an ego. Says, oh wow, this guy came down to bow down to me. It doesn't happen. So now Rav explains, when it comes to Baalei Chayim, you can't compare live things to trees. Now the Gemara wants to try to bring a raya to Rav Sheshes. In other words, when it comes to the halacha, our Mishnah told us that there's kala, there's shame, and there's the fact that it was a stumbling block. Which one? Do you need both, or is one of them sufficient? Tashema, look at our Mishnah. Davar achar shlo tehei behema overes bashuk. We don't want to have an animal walking through the marketplace. The Yomi, and people are going to say, zuish niskuploni al yada. This is the animal that the person died because of that. Now, my love, let's try to think about this. Midas Seifa, the top of Nehayim base. Midas Seifa, takala v'kalon. The end of the Mishnah was a case where there was takala and kalon. Again, it's talking about a person's being shamed by this. And of course, there was a takala, person engaged in this kind of behavior with it. Reisha, in other words, what's the seifa? What's the second line adding? It must be the second line was adding that you know why it's worse? Because there's shame and it was a stumbling block. Reisha, the beginning, what was it missing? It was takala below kalon. That reason was sufficient. The fact that it was a takala, stumbling block, and not shameful, and still we put the animal to death. So you seem to have an open and shut line in the Mishnah that tells you that takala, being a stumbling block for a yid to go ahead and do an avera is enough to put the animal to death. It does not need to come along with the thought process of shame. Now, what would be a case where there is takala without shame? A case of an akum who engages in this relationship with an animal. For some reason, he might not be as ashamed of it. In that case, he's going to have takala. Of course, is it? Hold on a second. Yeah, he's going to have takala takala without kala. The Gemara says, "Lai, that's incorrect. Seifa takala v'kala." The seifa, of course, we know there's a stumbling block there. That's the reason why it's put to death. And kala, because the shame is also the reason why it's put to death. Reisha hakamashmal. The Reisha is teaching us the following halacha: Dafilu kalon below takala nam mechayev. It's teaching us even if there's shame without there being a stumbling block, in that case he's going to be chayev. Veichidami. How do you find the case where a person had this relationship with an animal and there is shame, but no takala, no avera? Yisrael habal behema b'shogeg. A Yisrael who engaged in this type of relationship with an animal b'shogeg. He didn't know it was usher. He didn't bother showing up to Daf Yomi. He did not know. He didn't come to shul when he lay in that week's parsha. He did not know that it was usher in such a case. So the takala is not really there because it was a shogeg. But the kala on the shame, of course, is terrible. And the Gemara now compares it to the question Rav Huna asked. The Rav Huna asked the following question: Yisrael haba al behema b'shogeg. Now, what's the halacha if Yisrael engages with an animal by mistake? What's the halacha? Do you need takala v'kalon? Takala v'kalon be'ina? Do you have to have both, that it's a stumbling block and that it's shameful? V'chakalon ika. There's definitely shame that comes along with it. Takala leka, but it was b'shogeg, and therefore it doesn't get the full avera of a bezit. O dilma, maybe kalon afal pi she'ein takala. Maybe the shame is enough, and still you put the animal to death. Rav Yosef Tashema. Let's try to bring a raya. The Gemara goes through two cases. Bas shalosh shana. These are not such long brises, but it goes through a bunch of cases just to prove this point. The Gemara says as follows: Just wanted to be very clear about this. I mentioned this yesterday, I'm mentioning it again. We're talking here about the halachic nature of what we would consider to be a halachic bia. In any case, this is still going to be a bia. The question is whether halachically it comes along with the consequences that come along with a halachic bia. In other words, there's the action of bia, and then there are the halachic consequences that come along with the bia. The Gemara is explaining when a number of examples of the halachic consequences of a bia when it comes to children. A girl who is 3 years and 1 day, miskadeshes bebia. If her father marries her off and they get married with bia, that bia is considered to be halachic bia. Now she is married. If her brother-in-law who died, if she fell to yibum and her brother-in-law performed a live-right marriage on her, then the yibum works. In other words, in Ba'ala Yavam, her Yavam brother-in-law was Baal her Kana. She is now married. If she's married and she, at this age, engages with another person, there's a chiyuv of Eishes Ish. Umitama is Ba'ala. If she happens to be a Nida, it's technically possible even for a child, then Mitama is Ba'ala. In Tami Mishkav Tachtav Ke'elyon, we're not going to get into the Hilchos Tumah over here, but Mishkav Tachtav Ke'elyon is basically even if there's no Negiah, but the Tumah will go to a very high level of Tumah. And again, a person engages in bia with her while she is a nida, then that person becomes tamei as well. Nisis the Kohen, if she gets married to a Kohen, ochelas betruma, then if she gets married by way of bia, then yes, she gets the truma. If someone who is pasul, who she's not allowed to be married to, engages with her at this age, pasla min kahuna, she becomes disqualified for marrying a kohen. If one of the forbidden relatives engage with her, then or any other arayas, then mumasana yada, that type of bia with her would be considered to be a halachic bia, and they would be put to death on that. Vihi petura, she is petura. She is exempt, obviously, because she's a child. Echad mikol arayas. Now, when you go back to this, it said, who engaged with her? Echad mikol arayas amuris petura. Any of the arayas that engaged with her. What does that mean? And even a behema. Look at this case. The kalon ika, there's terrible shame. She's a child, she has to grow up. Knowing that she engaged in this kind of relationship with an animal, takala leka, she's a child. She's a child, and therefore there's no takala. The avera isn't there. So you see very clearly that when there's shame alone, without the takala, that's sufficient. All those arayos will be put to death by way of this kind of relationship. So if there's an animal relationship with her, and she's a child, so in this case it's clear there's no takala, she didn't do an avera, she's a child. And still, the animals will be put to death. So you seem to see very clearly that you don't need to have both reasons, takala being a stumbling block and being shameful. Being shameful is enough because in this case there was no aver. The Gemara says, no, you misunderstood this. Kiva de mezidahi. This is the case where she did it intentionally. She knew what she was doing. The takala namiika. There is a takala. Now, why isn't she punished? Rachmana hu dechasa alea. The Torah had Rachmanas on her. She's a child, she doesn't really know what she's doing. Therefore, the Torah says, even though she did this on purpose, the actions of children are actions of children, and she's not going to be punished for it. But again, you can't say there's no takala because, of course, she intentionally engaged in this kind of behavior, so therefore there is a takala. And yes, she did do an avera. Will she be punished? She won't actually be punished. Okay. Where does the Rachmanis go? How far does the mercy of the Torah go? It goes to a person, but not to a behema. More goes one more case, a similar case. Amarava Tashamal, let's bring a raya to whether or not you have to have takala and kalon, or is kalon enough. Do you have to have a stumbling block and the shame, or is the shame alone enough? Tashema ben teisha shanav yom echad. The parallel price when it comes to a male. So he's 9 years old and one day. Habal Yavimto, he goes and engages in a relationship with his Yavama. So if his brother died and left behind a sister-in-law without children, and he goes ahead and he's Boel, his sister-in-law, Kana. He's Kana her, and they're married. The Eino no saying get Achi Yagdil. He can't divorce her until he gets older because he's not old enough to be able to write a get. Umetame Kanida. If he engages in a relationship with a nida, he becomes tameh with mishkav tachtun ke'elyon. Posel, he passes someone to kahuna with an inappropriate relationship. If he engages, if he's a kohen, he cannot go ahead and allow the girl to eat truma. If he engages in this kind of relationship with an animal, he disqualifies it from being brought on top of the mizbeach. And there will be skila by way of this type of relationship. Now again, if this male 9 years and 1 day is intimate with any of their arayos who are said in the Torah, they shall be put to death by way of this type of relationship. Now clearly, in this case, kalon ika, there is shame takala leka, there's no stumbling block. Why? Because he's a child. Nevertheless, Vikatani, we learned, niskela sayado, the person will get skila by way of this case. So again, same exact thing, a parallel case. Here we have a child. We can't consider it to be a takala because he's a child. Nevertheless, this terrible shame that comes along with it. And what does it say? The animal shall be put to death. You seem to have a clear raya of Sheshes that says that if the simple shame alone, that will be enough to put the animal to death. Gemara says no, the same teretz. Kiva demesidhu, since this child who did this on purpose, it was intentional, takala nami ika. Yes, there is a takala. This child did an avera. Rachmana hu dechasa uluvei. The Torah had Rachmanas on him by saying, listen, he's a child, doesn't know what he's doing. We're not going to punish him with capital punishment. Now, where does that mercy go? Chas Rachmana behem. The mercy only goes so far as the person, but not the animal. We don't have enough time left, but this is a major sugya in the halachas of chinuch, because what we said over here is not pashat. In other words, the idea that it's considered to be an avera for a child, but he's not going to be punished, this is subject to a big discussion. How do we view children under the age of bar mitzvah when it comes to mitzvahs and averos? Is it just a separate mitzvah of chinuch, or which is really essentially incumbent on the father, or are the children actually obligated for those mitzvahs? Can't get into that. It's the whole discussion. Because chinuch goes through it. And in this case, it seems like our Gemara is at least saying that there is a takala, there is an avera. When it comes to the punishment is not imposed. Tashema, Davar Acher, go back to our Mishnah. Shalot Tehei Behema Averes Bashuk, V'yomeru Zuish Nisko Polonia Yada. Our Mishnah says the reason you put the animal to death when it's the subject of bestiality is because we don't want this animal roaming the streets and people pointing it and saying, oh, this is the animal that so-and-so was killed for engaging with. My love, again, the same thing as earlier. Need to say it to Kala V'Kalon, since the second line of the Mishnah is adding the factor that it's a stumbling block and shameful, Reisha Kala below Takala. The beginning is a case where it's shame but no actual Avera. Ve'echidami, what's that case? Yisrael ba behema b'shogeg. If a Yisrael engages with an animal, by mistake, he didn't know that it was Asr. Versus lie, incorrect, Seifa Takala v'Kala, Reisha Takala below Kala. The Seifa is talking about a case of Takala and Kala obvious. In other words, he did an Avera, so it was a stumbling block, and Kala was embarrassing. Reisha is talking about a case where there's Takala, where there was an Avera below Kalon, there's no shame. Ve'echidami, what's the case where there's an Avera and there's no shame? What's that? Ovid kechavim abba behema. It's an Ovid Kechavim who engages in this relationship with the Behema. This Ovid Kechavim, this idolater, is not ashamed of it, and perhaps even if there is some element of shame, perhaps the Torah is not as concerned about the shame of an idolater, and therefore we're not going to have a raya. We're still going to have the same question from Rosh Hashem's. The Gemara was not able to resolve